because what came next was going to be even bigger. Racist judge thought she was just another black teenager with an attitude, until she revealed she was a licensed attorney investigating him. The courtroom had its own rhythm, a quiet hum of shuffled papers, the occasional cough, and the dull murmur of lawyers exchanging last-minute strategies. But today, there was something different in the air, a tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting to see what would unfold. At the center of it all, Judge Raymond Lancaster sat perched on his bench, high above the rest of the room. His presence was like an old, unshakable oak. He had spent 3 decades in this chair, his reputation carved into the wood just as much as it was into the lives of the people who stood before him. He was a man of routine, predictable, unwavering, and though he would never admit it, he liked things a certain way, which was why, as 19-year-old Amira Daniels stood before him in worn jeans and a simple blouse, he barely looked up from the case file. Another one, another young black woman wasting the court's time. He already knew how this would end. He had seen it 100 times before. His fingers drummed lazily against the bench as he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Daniels," he drawled, dragging her name out like an inconvenience. "I see here that you were arrested for interfering with police business, resisting arrest, a direct violation of—" He paused, waving a dismissive hand toward the prosecutor, who barely looked interested in presenting the charges. "Frankly, it doesn't matter. You were told to move, and you didn't. That's a problem." The audience, mostly spectators who had nothing better to do, chuckled at the way he dismissed her. The officers who had arrested her stood stiffly near the door, arms crossed, looking smug. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, didn't even bother looking up from his notes. Amira stood silent, watching, listening, unfazed. Judge Lancaster tilted his head, waiting. When she didn't respond immediately, his lips curled into something between impatience and amusement. "Miss Daniels, do you think this is a joke?" Finally, she spoke. "No, Your Honor." "Then I suggest you show some respect for this court and take responsibility for your actions. Maybe, if you paid more attention in school, you wouldn't be standing here today." That line. That single, condescending remark set something off in the room. There was a slight shift, almost imperceptible. A hush spread thick and slow. The snickering stopped. Even the prosecutor glanced up from his papers. But Amira? She didn't flinch. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before slipping her hand into her bag. The bailiffs took a reflexive step forward. The judge rolled his eyes, already preparing to dismiss whatever pathetic argument she was about to offer. But when she pulled out a sleek black leather case and flipped it open on the table, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The courtroom froze. Inside the case was a bar card, shiny, polished, unmistakable. A document that only licensed attorneys carried. A credential that should have been impossible for a 19-year-old. Amira placed it on the defense table, tapping it lightly with one finger. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, calm, and unshaken. "I did pay attention in school. I graduated law school at 18, passed the bar on my first attempt, and I'm here undercover for a legal watchdog organization." It took 3 full seconds before anyone in the courtroom reacted. 3 seconds of dead silence before whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Lancaster's smirk vanished. The prosecutor sat up straighter, flipping frantically through his files. The officers near the door exchanged glances. The game had changed. But Lancaster wasn't ready to lose. The silence stretched, the kind that made people shift in their seats, their own discomfort filling the spaces where words should be. Even the air felt heavier. Judge Lancaster blinked, his brain working to catch up with what he had just seen. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes flicked to the bar card on the table, as if staring at it long enough might make it disappear. It didn't. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, whispers turning into full conversations in hushed tones. Who is she? Is this real? The bailiffs shifted uneasily. The prosecutor, Calloway, flipped through his papers like the answer to what was happening might be buried somewhere in his notes. Amira stood unmoving. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smirking, or waiting for applause. She just watched the judge patiently, as though waiting for him to catch up to a reality he had never considered possible. Lancaster cleared his throat, forcing his voice back to the surface. This is ridiculous," he scoffed, the sound forced and hollow. "A stunt, a lie, there's no way." He turned toward Calloway. "Is there any record of this woman being a member of the bar?" Calloway hesitated. I don't know, Your Honor. Your Honor, this is the body cam transcript from the officers who arrested me," she said, her voice steady, confident. "It shows I asked a single question. What's the charge?" She let the words settle. That was the extent of my involvement. No threats, no obstruction. Just a question. She slid the folder toward the bailiff, who hesitated, then picked it up and handed it to Lancaster. The judge snatched it, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the first few lines and his jaw tightened. Amira continued, her voice unwavering. "The Supreme Court has ruled that speech alone does not constitute obstruction unless it directly interferes with law enforcement actions. Asking a question is not a crime." Lancaster's fingers clenched the edge of the folder. "That's not for you to decide." She met his glare with an ease that unsettled him. "It's already been decided. Houston versus Hill, 1987. The Supreme Court held that individuals have the right to verbally challenge police officers without fear of arrest. If you'd like, I can cite additional cases where officers were found to have unlawfully detained civilians for simply speaking." More murmurs rippled through the courtroom. People sat forward, eyes locked onto the young woman dismantling the judge in real time. Lancaster's face darkened. He turned back to Calloway, who was still glued to his screen, typing frantically. "Well," Calloway cleared his throat. His voice strained. "Your Honor, she is a licensed attorney. Her credentials check out." The tension in the room cracked wide open. A wave of whispers. A journalist in the back reached for their phone. A bailiff's mouth parted slightly before he caught himself. But Lancaster refused to let the shift settle. His pride, his authority, was hanging by a thread, and he wasn't about to let some 19-year-old cut it. "This is highly inappropriate," he snapped. "You come in here, disrupt my court, and expect me to what? Dismiss your case because you think you're smarter than me." Amira didn't blink. "No, Your Honor. I expect you to dismiss my case because the law requires you to—" The words landed like a strike to the ribs. But Amira wasn't finished. She stepped closer to the defense table, planting her hands on the polished wood. Her voice was lower now, forcing everyone to lean in. "And while we're here, we should also address something else." She let the pause stretch, just enough to build tension. "Your Honor, I have been reviewing transcripts of your past rulings. A troubling pattern has emerged." A cold sliver of silence sliced through the room. Amira reached into her bag one last time and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. "Would you like to discuss the statistical breakdown of your sentencing disparities?" Judge Lancaster's entire demeanor changed. But he wasn't the only one in trouble now. The whole courtroom could feel it. The weight of Amira's words settled over the room like an approaching storm. The stack of documents sat untouched on the table, but its presence alone was enough to make Lancaster shift in his seat. His eyes darted to the pages, then back to Amira, as if considering whether acknowledging them would make them real. He didn't want to read them. He already knew what they contained. She reached into her bag again, slowly, deliberately, as if daring someone to try and stop her. This time, she pulled out a thin folder and placed it on the table. His fingers scrambled across his keyboard, typing furiously. His face had lost some color. Lancaster turned back to Amira, his irritation surfacing in sharp bursts. "So what? You think this changes anything? You were still obstructing an arrest?" Amira tilted her head. "Was I?" The question landed like a hammer. The problem was, so did she. "Your Honor," Amira continued, her voice calm, methodical, "over the past 10 years, your sentencing record shows a consistent pattern." She let the words hang in the air before continuing. "For defendants charged with similar offenses, black individuals receive harsher penalties than their white counterparts. In some cases, twice the recommended sentencing." A ripple of unease passed through the room. A journalist near the back furiously scribbled notes. Calloway, the prosecutor, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Lancaster exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "This is not relevant to today's hearing." "It is," Amira countered, "if you intend to rule against me, because that would make this another case added to your growing list of discriminatory rulings." For the first time since the proceedings began, the judge had no immediate response. Amira reached forward and slid the thick folder closer to her, flipping it open. "Let's start with a case from 5 years ago," she said, pulling out the first page. "A white college student arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. You dismissed the charges, citing youthful indiscretion." The courtroom was dead silent. Amira flipped to the next page. A black high school senior, same charges, same circumstances, sentenced to 60 days in county jail. The air felt tighter. Lancaster gripped the arms of his chair. Amira turned another page. "Here's another. White defendant, possession of marijuana, first offense. You ordered probation." She held up the next document. "Black defendant, same charge, first offense. You gave him 3 years." "Enough," Lancaster barked, his voice cracking. "This is not a trial against me." "No," Amira said smoothly, "but maybe it should be." The murmurs in the courtroom swelled. Someone near the back let out a low whistle. Even the bailiffs, who normally remained stoic, looked uneasy. Amira leaned forward, her voice lower now, forcing Lancaster to listen. "I'm not the first person to notice your pattern, Your Honor. Civil rights organizations have been collecting this data for years." She let that sink in. "And you know what they found?" Lancaster didn't answer. "They found that your courtroom has one of the highest racial sentencing disparities in the state. And that's not an opinion. That's a fact." The judge's hand hovered over his gavel, but he didn't strike it, because he knew she was right. The room felt like it was tilting, the balance of the power shifting with every word that left Amira's mouth. But she wasn't finished. She pulled out one last sheet of paper and held it up. "This is a formal complaint filed with the Judicial Conduct Board last month." She let that settle before continuing. "Multiple attorneys have alleged bias in your rulings. And guess what? This case, my case, was flagged as part of their review. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Lancaster's face. He knew what that meant. A formal investigation, public scrutiny, and if enough cases were found to be unjust, disbarment. The reporters in the back had stopped taking notes. They were just watching now, watching a judge who had spent decades sitting comfortably in his power squirm for the first time. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. It belonged to her, and the entire country was about to find out. But Amira wasn't done yet. Judge Lancaster's grip on his gavel tightened, his knuckles turning white as the tension in the room mounted. He could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation, a sensation he wasn't used to feeling on this side of the bench. He cleared his throat, but the rasp in his voice betrayed the unease creeping in. "This is a courtroom, not a media circus. You have no authority here," Lancaster's voice thundered. "Miss Daniels, you are the defendant, and I am the judge." Amira lifted an eyebrow. "Are you?" The question landed like a slap. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even the bailiff, who had remained motionless, shifted slightly. Lancaster's mouth pressed into a thin line, his glare meant to silence her. But Amira wasn't easily silenced. "Your Honor," she said, slow and deliberate. "A judge's power comes from the law, not the bench they sit on. And the law says you're required to be impartial." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The Judicial Code of Conduct states that a judge must act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. She let the words sink in before continuing. "Yet your history tells a different story." Lancaster slammed his gavel down. "You are out of line." Amira didn't flinch. "You can pound that gavel all you want," she said, her voice unwavering. "But it won't change the fact." She turned slightly, looking toward the reporters in the back. "I wonder how the public will feel knowing a sitting judge has been knowingly handing out discriminatory sentences for decades." Lancaster's chest rose and fell, his breath uneven. For the first time he looked small, trapped in the very seat of power that once made him invincible. Calloway, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that he was on the wrong side of history. He glanced at Lancaster, then at the documents sprawled across the table. Amira wasn't just exposing a biased judge, she was forcing an entire system to answer for itself. And she wasn't stopping there. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice razor-sharp, "I move to have my case dismissed immediately on the grounds of judicial misconduct." Another gasp rippled through the room. Lancaster's jaw clenched. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. "You can't," he started. But Amira was already turning to Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, "as the prosecutor, you have the discretion to drop these charges right now." Calloway's face paled. He was backed into a corner. The evidence was clear. The cameras were rolling, and public perception was shifting before his eyes. If he chose to pursue this, he wouldn't just be seen as complicit. He'd be seen as an active participant in a corrupt system. He hesitated for just a moment before exhaling deeply and looking at the judge. "The prosecution withdraws all charges, Your Honor." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, the frantic clicking of keyboards as reporters rushed to capture the moment. Lancaster froze, his face drained of all color. Amira tilted her head slightly. "Looks like the law finally caught up with you." The judge's gavel hovered in the air, his power now just a formality. He could do nothing. He had lost. But Amira wasn't finished yet. The weight of it all settled into the room, pressing down on Lancaster like a judge's own gavel slamming against his career. His mouth opened, then shut. His authority, once absolute, had evaporated in an instant. His own prosecutor had just withdrawn the charges. His courtroom, his domain, was now a spectacle for the world to see. The reporters in the back were already typing furiously, their fingers flying across keyboards. Court employees exchanged glances, unsure whether they were watching a legal proceeding or the public dismantling of a powerful man. The judge's face burned red as he gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't used to losing. But this wasn't just a loss. This was exposure. Amira turned toward the crowd, her voice steady. For years, men like Judge Lancaster have hidden behind their robes, believing themselves untouchable. But today, the system he upheld is being forced to answer for itself. A man in the gallery clapped once, then again. Soon, others joined in, the sound swelling through the room. Lancaster's eyes darted across the crowd, panic flickering behind his mask of arrogance. Amira turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, almost mocking the title now, "before I leave this courtroom, I'd like to remind you of something." She took a step closer. "The judicial complaint against you? It's been expanded." She gestured to the thick stack of documents on the table. "The evidence I presented today. It will be formally submitted as part of that investigation." Lancaster's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. Ethics violations, review boards, formal hearings, disbarment. Calloway, still at his table, rubbed a hand down his face, processing the fallout in real time. He had no intention of going down with Lancaster. That much was clear. Lancaster tried one last time to regain control. His voice wobbled, but he forced it out. But Amira didn't let him finish. She spoke over him, her voice firm. "Your Honor, you spent decades making sure black defendants got the harshest punishments. You stole futures. You broke families apart. You played God with people's lives." Lancaster's nostrils flared. "And now," Amira said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you're the one on trial." The room erupted again. This time, there was no stopping the reaction. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and two uniformed officials walked in, court officers from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Lancaster's face went sheet white. Everyone saw it. He knew what this meant. One of the officials stepped forward, his voice booming over the noise. "Judge Lancaster, due to the ongoing investigations into multiple judicial complaints, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending further review." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters sprang to their feet, cameras flashing. The audience erupted into a mix of cheers and gasps. Lancaster stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. Amira watched it all unfold, her expression unreadable. But as she gathered her bag and walked toward the exit, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Justice had finally come knocking. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The sound in the courtroom was like a crashing wave, conversations spilling over one another, reporters barking orders to their photographers, the murmurs of legal clerks who had worked under Lancaster for years now, whispering as though their entire reality had just been shattered. Judge Lancaster hadn't moved. His gavel, once a symbol of absolute authority, hung uselessly in his grip. His eyes darted to the court officers, now standing at either side of his bench. Their presence was quiet confirmation that his time was up. Amira took in the scene with measured calm. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this moment, this was the first real consequence for a man who had spent decades ruining lives under the guise of justice. Lancaster finally found his voice, but it was shakier than before. "This is a mistake," he muttered, though no one seemed to be listening. "I've served this court faithfully for 30 years. This is a witch hunt." A dry laugh broke out from someone in the crowd. "Faithfully," a woman's voice called out. "Tell that to my brother. He's doing 10 years for the same charge you dismissed for a white college kid." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Others began to speak up, emboldened by Lancaster's fall from power. The moment was turning into something bigger. Amira turned to Calloway. The prosecutor, still visibly shaken, looked at her like he had just witnessed the impossible. He had aligned himself with Lancaster for years. "Now that I've won my case," she said, her voice even, "I'd like to ask you something." Calloway swallowed hard. "What?" She tilted her head slightly, watching him squirm. "How many cases like mine have you prosecuted under this judge?" The question landed like a punch to the gut. Calloway blinked, caught off guard. He started, but stopped himself. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll tell you how many," Amira continued. "Too many." The silence was deafening. She held Calloway's gaze, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Calloway exhaled sharply, but now that ship was sinking fast and he knew it. She took a slow step toward him. He hesitated again, then, with a weight in his voice that hadn't been there before, he finally said, "I'll cooperate with the investigation." A collective gasp filled the room. Lancaster's head snapped up. "You can't be serious, Calloway." The prosecutor didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Amira. "I was part of this system," he admitted. "I won't defend it anymore." Amira studied him. She had seen men like him before. Comfortable, complicit, protected. But something about this moment felt real. Maybe he meant it. Maybe, for the first time in his career, he had seen the cracks in the foundation of the system he had upheld. Or maybe he just knew he didn't want to go down with Lancaster. Either way, it didn't matter. "Good," Amira said simply. "Then let's get to work." She turned back toward the judge. Lancaster's breathing was shallow now, his face drawn. He was still fighting to regain control, still clinging to the last shreds of power he thought he had. But that power was gone. One of the court officers stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, his tone firm but procedural, "you'll need to come with us." For the first time, Judge Raymond Lancaster was being ordered out of his own courtroom, and he had no choice but to comply. As he was escorted out, Amira picked up her documents and slung her bag over her shoulder. The cameras stayed on her, capturing every movement. She had come in accused. She was leaving victorious. And the world was watching. But this wasn't just about her case. It was about something much bigger. The echoes of the day's events stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The headlines hit within minutes, flooding news sites and social media. Judge suspended after explosive courtroom confrontation. 19-year-old lawyer exposes judicial bias in shocking legal showdown. Prosecutor flips on longtime judge, pledges to cooperate in investigation. By the time Amira stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air, reporters were already gathered on the courthouse steps, their microphones and cameras poised like weapons, ready to capture every word. She barely had time to breathe before the questions came. Rapid fire. "Miss Daniels, did you expect this outcome today? How long have you been investigating Judge Lancaster? What do you say to people who claim you set this up?" She held up a hand, silencing the crowd with just her presence. "I didn't set anything up," she said. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "I did what the law allows every citizen to do, challenge injustice." The flashes of cameras illuminated her face, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't here for fame. She wasn't here for recognition. She was here because this was bigger than her. From the corner of her eye, she spotted a woman standing apart from the crowd, arms crossed tightly over her chest. A look of quiet disbelief mixed with cautious admiration was written across her face. Amira recognized her immediately. Lena Warren, the sister of the high school senior who had been given jail time under Lancaster, while a white student had walked free. Their eyes met. No words needed to be spoken. Lena nodded once, a small but powerful acknowledgement. Amira nodded back. This wasn't just about one case. This was about hundreds of people who had been railroaded by a system that was never meant to serve them. People like Lena's brother. And now that system was cracking under its own weight. A sharp beep pulled her attention back to reality, her phone vibrating relentlessly in her pocket. She stepped away from the cameras, pulling it out to see the barrage of messages flooding in. Some were from friends, some from lawyers, some from people she had never met, thanking her. But one message stood out. Unknown number. We should talk. I have something you'll want to see. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen for a second before glancing back toward the courthouse. This wasn't over, not even close. With one last glance toward the reporters, she turned on her heel and walked away.